Why did they put death marks on the mummies?
Well, I think that's a really great question, and it's one that I think perhaps people are thinking about a bit more because we're all wearing masks so much. So why would somebody have a death mask in ancient Egypt? If you think about it, when the dead person was mummified and wrapped up in bandages, of course, his or her face would be covered all over with these wrappings, and we wouldn't be able to see his or her eyes and nose and mouth and even ears. They'd all be covered by the wrappings. And of course, the Egyptians needed to be able to breathe in the afterlife and to be able to open their mouths and eat and possibly even to speak. And they wanted their eyes so they could see and their ears so they could hear. So they would often have a mask, or almost always actually have a mask over their mummified body with those features shown on it. Now, that's not to say that the mask would have looked anything like the person who had died. The main thing was that we could actually just see those features painted onto it. And so the mask was really important because it meant that the person after death could continue to have a living existence of some sort. And we're very lucky in this museum because we've got one of the earliest examples of one of those masks on display in our galleries, and you can see it for yourself. And it's about 4,000 years old and made of bits of linen stuck over a shape that was held in place with animal glue, and it's then painted and made to look like a man. And we know that the man's name was Chai because it was found in his tomb lying over his body, and his name was written inside his tomb.
Did ancient Egyptians build houses?
Yes, they did indeed build houses, but they weren't made of stone. They were made of mud brick. And mud brick is actually a very good material for making a house in a desert country because it doesn't rain very much. So Egypt is a desert country. It just happens to have the River Nile running through it, which is why people can continue to live there. But it doesn't rain very much, and that means that if you make something out of mud, it can survive for quite a long time. The other thing that's rather good about mud brick is that it is nice and cool in the summer inside a mud brick house, and in the winter it's nice and warm. And I can tell you that from personal experience because I've stayed in a hotel made of mud brick, and it has been really pleasant, much nicer than staying in a concrete hotel, which has been much colder in the winter and much hotter in the summer. So mud brick's a great material. The houses that they made were fairly simple. You had a number of rooms going from front to back, often with the kitchen in the open air so that the smells and the smoke could go out of the house and not make it even hotter. Sometimes the central rooms had a higher roof, which allowed you to put a window on the side to the north, which is where the prevailing wind came from. And that allowed a breeze to come into your house and keep you cool. And some houses, in fact the nicest houses, had an upper floor. And you reached those by a set of stairs. And you might want to sleep in the upper floor if you wanted to keep cool in the summer. So it was a jolly good way to live. And we see examples of those sorts of houses painted on the decoration inside tombs. Also from examples like this kind of soul house that we see here in the museum, which is made of terracotta. And it's a magical building for the soul to live in the afterlife. But it shows us something about what a very nice, expensive house might have looked like, having 2 floors and these lovely columns holding the roof up and looking rather glamorous from the outside.
Why did the Egyptians get rid of the brain during mummification?
That's a really good question, since you'd think that the brain is one of the most important parts of the human body. But if we go back to the whole purpose of mummification, which was to preserve the body, the ancient Egyptians understood that in order to do this, you had to stop decomposition, or the body from wasting away. And part of this involved removing the internal organs. So mummification varied a lot over time, depending on the time period in which you lived and also how much money you had and your status. But if we think about the best practice standards of mummification, they removed the brain using a hook through the nose, and they also removed organs from your abdomen, so your stomach, your lungs, your liver and your intestines, and they placed these in what we call canopic jars. However, it seems like the Egyptians didn't quite have a completely well-rounded understanding of human anatomy, because they actually thought it was the heart that was the seat of your emotions and intellect rather than your brain. And in all fairness, this makes sense, because if you think about what happens when you're really excited or scared, it's your heart that you can feel pounding rather than your brain.
Why did they wrap the mummies?
When we typically think about mummy wrappings, we think about linen bandages, and I can imagine now a scene out of horrible histories with linen unfurling behind the mummy running towards you. And while this was popular practice, not everyone could actually afford it. You had to be quite wealthy and an elite member of society. So what did poorer people do? So they could be wrapped in organic matter such as plant stems, reeds and rushes. But regardless of the material, they served the same function. So essentially it was to protect the body and to keep it intact and like a human lifelike form. But it also served a magical purpose. So we know that when the priests were involved in the wrapping or the embalming, they read ritual spells and texts, and they also placed protective amulets between the wrappings too. And this all helped in the process of the deceased being reborn again, so he or she could live forever in the afterlife.
What is it like to go into an ancient Egyptian tomb?
Well, the overwhelming impression that you get when you go into an Egyptian tomb is the smell of dust and dirt. And it's often very hot as well inside there. And you have to remember that often these tombs haven't been opened for a very long time. So when you go in, you're the first person to be in there for such a long time. So as you walk around, you get this kind of puffs of dust going up into the air. And then you start to get this sense of a faint smell of like perfume. And that's probably coming from the resins of the wood, from the coffins. And it also may come from the perfumes that were poured over the bodies when they were buried or mummified. So that's quite a distinctive smell. Actually, I should say, when you open a showcase in the museum or a drawer with an object in it, often you get that smell too. And it takes you straight back to being inside the tomb. So this dust is absolutely everywhere, and once you start excavating, you find yourself surrounded by things covered in dust. So you find there's bits of wood, maybe from coffins, arms and legs sticking out possibly, or just some bones that you might see. Often there's also pottery, but it's all covered in this dust. And that's what you kind of brush away. But the dust is as fine as talcum powder. And it ends up covering you, absolutely. And I'm one of these people that gets very much covered by the dust. And it often amuses my colleagues to see me with this very, very dirty face. So this dust, as I say, is everywhere. And one thing that always amuses me is from our last excavations, when we were working in Luxor, is the fact that we actually borrowed a sheet from our bedroom to lay out some bits of coffin to see what it looked like when it was all put together. And it got absolutely filthy. You can't imagine how mucky it was. But when we took it back to the hotel, nobody commented or said anything about it, which is extraordinary. So the rooms that we're working in very often have quite smooth walls, or they can be very rough hewn, and you get this sort of sense of quite a small space that you're inside. But you get these really strange salt crystals that come out of the walls, and that's caused by the moisture in the rock that gets carried through the rock until it reaches an outside surface, and it picks up the salt as it travels through the rock till it gets to that outside surface where it evaporates, leaving the salt, and the salt builds up over time, and you get these extraordinary shaped crystals which are just bizarre as you look at them. So all in all, it's quite a fun thing to do, excavating. You see these strange things and you get to explore through really dirty spaces and get filthy, and everybody thinks that's absolutely fine.